Okay, guys, welcome. Today we're going to talk about trees. Now, we say that a graph is called a tree if it's connected and it contains no cycle as a subgraph, right? So here are some examples of trees. And the idea is that the tree, of course, is connected and it contains no cycle. So you can imagine that if you start at one node, you're not going to be able to get back to that node without crossing over some nodes that you've already used, right? Now, trees can be thought of as minimally connected and maximally cycle-free graphs, right? So the idea is that a graph is minimally connected by, if you were to remove an edge, by removing an edge, any edge, I should say, the graph would be disconnected. Right? And then also maximally cycle free means that if you were to add an edge anywhere, then you would get a cycle, right? So sort of a tree is thought of as sort of standing on this tightrope between minimally connected and maximally cycle free. Okay, so our first theorem is that a graph G is a tree if and only if it is connected, but by deleting any of its edges results in a disconnected graph. Right, and then of course part B, a graph G is a tree if and only if it contains no cycles, but adding any new edge creates a cycle. So that sort of summarizes what we just said. Okay, now the proof for part A, right? Now we have an if and only if proof, so we need to prove this in both directions, right? So I need to assume this and prove this in one proof, and then I also need to assume the second part and prove the first part. All right, so the forward direction is that we'll assume that G is a tree, right? Now we'll assume, since of course we're assuming that G is a tree, then that means that G is connected by definition, right? Now we're going to go for contradiction and we're going to assume that an edge UV is deleted from a tree and the remaining graph G prime is connected, okay? Then that means that G prime contains a path connecting U and V, right? Because of course it's connected. But if we put that edge UV back, we would form a cycle with P and the edge UV, right? And of course that gives us our contradiction. Now, if we prove the opposite direction, we're going to assume that G is connected, but removing any edge would give a disconnected graph. Now, we just need to show that G does not contain a cycle, right? Because G is already connected, so that part of being a tree is okay. Now, if we delete an edge of C, we would obtain a connected graph in this case because that would be a contradiction, right? So that shows that G, of course, does not contain any cycles, right? So because if we did assume that it had a cycle, then if we delete an edge, then we'd still have a connected graph. And part B, you could prove sort of in a similar fashion, and I'm going to leave that as an exercise for you just for time's sake. Okay, now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to consider a connected graph G that has n nodes and an edge E. Now, if we delete E, we may end up with a still connected graph, or we could end up with a disconnected graph. If we would form a disconnected graph by removing that edge E, we call E a cut edge, right? Now, by definition, this means that every edge of a tree is a cut edge, because if you were to remove any edge of a tree, you get a disconnected graph. Okay. Now that we've talked about trees, we can talk about the idea of a spanning tree. Now, if we're given any graph, if we find an edge that is not a cut edge, we delete it, right? And we continue doing this until you can't anymore. Then this is a subgraph of G with the same node set as G and is now a tree because we removed any edges that are not cut edges, right? So now at this point, Once we can't anymore, every single edge is a cut edge, which means that we have a tree, and we refer to this special tree as the spanning tree of G. Okay, so for example, let's see, let's go back to this example right here. So these are giving me trees, right? So what I could have is I maybe have some graph where I have some extra edges here. And if I wanted to find the spanning tree, I would get rid of this cut edge, or this edge, because it's not a cut edge, and same for these other ones that I drew in here. Right? So then that, of course, what would be left would be the spanning tree of that sort of augmented graph that I drew in there. Okay. Now, another type of tree that we'll talk about is what's called a rooted tree. Now, we refer to a special node on a rooted tree as a root, right? And if this root is specified, we call this a rooted tree, right? Now, of course, any node can be a root, but we're mostly interested in specified roots because they might have some sort of special property that we're interested in. Now, just for some terminology here, we let G be a rooted tree with a root R. Any node V that's different from R, there must be a unique path in the tree connecting V to R, right? Because it's a connected graph. Now, the node on the path next to V is considered the father of V, right? And the other neighbors are the sons of V, right? So for example, if you have a root R, and let's say here, these are just unnamed nodes, but we eventually want to get to, say, V right here, then we would say that this node right here is the father of V, right? And of course, if we were then to go this way out of V, these nodes would be the sons, right? So you can almost think of this as sort of like a family tree idea. That's sort of the idea, right? And then here's another diagram. Here we have that R does not have a father because it's the root. It's sort of like the very top of the tree, but all of its neighbors are its sons, right? So in this case, we have that V1 is the root, and V2, V3, and V4 are all its sons, right? So V2, V3, and V4 would have then, of course, by definition, have V1 as their father. V2 has sons V5, V6. V3 has sons V7 through V9. And V4 has sons V10 through V11. And of course, each of those considered nodes, right? This would be their father, for example. Okay. Now, every node different from the root has exactly one father, right? For obvious reasons, because there's no way that if we were to have another father here, right? If we were to have a father, say, over here, then this father would have had to come from the root, and now you have a cycle, which of course is no good in a tree. Okay. And then finally, we say that a node with no sons is called a leaf, right? So a leaf is a node with degree 1, and of course it's different from the root. So any of these these final things here would be considered a leaf. All right. So that concludes this video on trees. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.